Hey guys, I heard so many of you liked my stories about the butterflies that you wanted to know a little more about the park. To answer your first question, no, the butterflies have not been back, but it's pretty early in the season, so I guess they have time. Today, however, I want to talk about something else that happened last year. It wasn't quite as odd as the butterflies, but it was still pretty weird. As a park ranger, I often get called upon to do search and rescue. I know what you're thinking, and the answer is no. I didn't find any stairs in the woods. I have yet to see a set, actually, and I hope to never encounter them. I did find something weird out there, though. Something I want to talk about, since you guys seem willing to listen. Fair warning, though, it's pretty strange, and I don't really have an explanation for it. So last summer, we got a call about a 9-year-old kid, Michael Peters, who'd gone missing from his campsite. That's not as uncommon as you might think. Little kids like to wander off on their own a lot, since they think they're immortal. It wouldn't be the first time we had to go look for some wannabe Bear Grylls who decided to go out and play in the woods, only to end up playing naked and afraid after a night of wandering in the woods. We were hoping we would find him alive, since it had only been about 24 hours since he'd gone missing. The parents were pretty upset, as parents are often wont to do, and the Forestry Service was calling for all hands on deck so that they could find this kid before something bad happened to him. So, we all put on our hiking boots, grabbed some provisions, and went out to have a look. If this all sounds a little cavalier, then I'm sorry. After a while, the attitude is how you distance yourself from the terrible things that sometimes happen here. Children go missing, people die of exposure, hikers are caught in landslides while hiking a trail that's rated for amateurs. If you stop to think about all of it, it really makes you wonder why you do it. We were pretty confident that we could find the kid. He hadn't been missing that long, and the chances were pretty good that he had just gotten lost in the woods and was waiting for someone to find him. We set out at first light, radios and gears strapped on just in case, and I was given the area around Carpenter's Woods. Carpenter's Woods gets its name from Alistair Carpenter, a man who lived on the property before it was a national park. Alistair Carpenter had come from New York, hoping to find a life that was a little simpler. He'd been an avid hiker for most of his life, and it's said that he had hiked all he meant to in the area surrounding his home. He wanted a challenge, wanted to go somewhere where his money wouldn't do him any good. So, he came out here to the middle of nowhere, built a cabin, and lived off the land. For the next 40 years of his life, this was where he lived. He fished in the streams, hunted the deer, generally kept his head down, and tried not to be noticed by the local Native American tribes, who still lived in the area. This was in the late 1800s, so the land still wasn't quite as settled as it would be. And when others found Carpenter out here thriving, they were impressed. When the park was first marked out in the 40s, the surveyors found his cabin and, incidentally, the remains of Alistair Carpenter. The cabin was still there and is now one of our biggest tourist draws. The remains were laid to rest at Katy Merrill Methodist Church, which is also on the grounds, and is another place that history buffs also come to see. I started my search at the cabin, not an uncommon place for people to go. It had been locked up since we didn't have a regular guide to come out here, and the inside was more than a little musty. The cabin was full of old furniture, the rustic kind that you make out of actual trees, as well as some shadow boxes of tools that Mr. Carpenter had used to survive. I didn't see any sign that anyone had come out here, inside or out, so I locked up the cabin and proceeded into the woods. The trails around the cabin are quite nice. They're also low-impact trails, so your grandmother could probably hike them without a lot of prep work. They're meant to be casually enjoyed, so it felt plausible that he would have gone down this way. The cabin was only a mile from the campsite where he'd gone missing, so I figured if we were going to find him anywhere, it'd probably be around here. It was hard not to equate him to the missing girl during the butterfly incident. I really hoped we wouldn't find him in a similar state, but it hadn't been the worst way that someone had died during that event, I suppose. The remains of the girl had been almost lovingly taken care of, and I suppose there were worse ways for a child to suffer in the forest. I was trying to remain positive, hoping for a happy ending on this one, but happy endings in the real world don't happen often enough. I'd been walking for about half an hour when I came across something in the tree line. It was a colorful chip bag, the smiling face of the orange goldfish looking back at me, and given its placement, I turned to look down one of the utility trails that led into the woods. These were not low-impact trails. They were cut to give access to pump sheds, or sheds where we keep extra equipment, and they were often overgrown or less habitable than the communal trails for guests. If a kid had just rambled through the woods, I suppose it wouldn't be out of place for him to pick a trail at random and continue on his adventure. I got out the radio and called in what I had found, telling him I was heading towards the N-17 shed, and dispatch came back in the affirmative, telling me to be careful. So, I headed into the woods. I found the shed without too much trouble, and that was where I found my next clue. There was a water bottle sitting on the stoop of the shed. That wasn't terribly out of place either, since a lot of the rangers are kind of slobs. They preach about leaving no sign, but a lot of that comes down to do as I say and not as I do agenda. It would have been easy to just brush off, except when I looked at the bottle, it had 3 greasy-looking fingerprints emblazoned in orange dust on the outside. I had had enough siblings to know goldfish crumbs when I saw them, and it led me to believe that whoever had dropped the chip bag had probably had the water bottle too. Again, it didn't necessarily have to be the kid. As I looked around, I saw a side trail that led from the shed towards another utility trail. This one was overgrown, and I honestly couldn't picture a kid going down this way. I was ready to head back to the main trail when something caught my eye. A piece of fabric hanging from one of the overgrown branches. Just a little scrap of blue in that sea of green. Stood out like a sore thumb. I tried to remember what the parents had said the kid was wearing, and it seemed like blue shorts had been mentioned. I sighed. It would be the trail that led into Narnia, wouldn't it? Taking some gloves out of my bag, I started picking my way through the thick brush and overhanging thorns. It was slow going, as I had known it would be. But as I finally came through the tangles, I found a trail that was in slightly better shape than the ones leading away from the shed. The canopy overhead was dark, making me think of going through a tunnel, and the deeper I went, the stranger the sounds around me became. At one point, I could have sworn I heard a train whistle, but that shouldn't have been possible. The closest train would have been 30 miles to the west, nowhere near close enough to be heard, even on a clear day. I walked for about an hour and a half, and just as I was beginning to question how long the service trail was, I came upon the last thing I would have expected to find in a national park. It was a train station. I was completely still for a moment, just taking it all in as I tried to make sense of it. It was a perfectly normal-looking train station, sitting in the middle of the woods. Tracks were running off into the tree line in 2 directions, and both came up to a platform where you could buy tickets and little knickknacks or newspapers from the adjacent gift shop. It was all very clean, all very well maintained, and it was one of the strangest things I had ever seen in my entire life. I don't mean it was abnormal. I'd seen train stations before, just not out in the middle of the woods. It was jarring, like finding a perfectly preserved dining room table in the middle of an open field, or a cabin on a mountainside with the lights on and no one inside. It made me question my sanity as I approached it, but it was all very stable and very stationary. The ticket booth was empty, but I hadn't expected there would be anyone there. The Forestry Service barely had enough spare money to pay overtime, let alone to run a train station. The gift shop was equally empty, and most of the magazines were from the 90s. A Times magazine was talking about the Bill Clinton scandal. An Entertainment Today discussed a young up-and-comer named Britney Spears, and a tech magazine was talking about a revolutionary new computer that had 512 megabytes of memory. There were some snacks and some little toys as well, but all the snacks were expired, and I didn't feel like picking up a case of food poisoning to go along with all the weirdness. I wondered if the kid had found his way here too, and was rewarded by a little blue jacket sitting on one of the benches by the pickup area. It had one of those dogs from the Paw Patrol on it, the firefighter one, and it had also been in the reports with the blue shorts and the little green trainers that the kid had been wearing. He had been here for sure, and I wondered if maybe he had walked up the tracks, thinking it would take him back to civilization. I didn't know where those tracks went, but I was having a similar idea when I heard that lonesome train whistle come again. It was followed by an honest-to-God locomotive, and as I stood there stunned, the whole place shook as the train pulled out of the woods and came to rest by the loading area. It was a deep forest green, bearing the number 56 on the side of the loco, and it had 3 cars behind it which were fire engine red and looked freshly painted. The whole thing looked way too new to be crashing through the woods, and as the doors opened, I wondered if I ought to go in. I could only imagine that to some kid lost in the woods, the train would seem very cool. I stepped on board to see if he might still be there, hoping that we wouldn't go too far. I had never seen a second train stop in the woods, but I'd never seen a train in the woods until today either. The doors of the train shut as I stepped inside, and I braced myself as it lurched into motion. The inside of the train was nice, if not a little Spartan. The car I was in was nothing but rows of seats that were clean but not particularly interesting. I turned to the front of the car to see if I could have a look at the driver, but the door was locked and I couldn't see much of the engine. There was definitely a shadowy somebody behind the wheel, moving fitfully as he turned knobs and gears, but he ignored my pounding, and eventually I was forced to go explore the rest of the train. The second car appeared to be a dining car. The seats were replaced with tables and benches, and there was a long bar that was unmanned like everything else here. I called out to get someone's attention, but much like the driver, no one ever came to answer me. I didn't see the kid, so I decided to check the third car, and was finally rewarded with another person. Michael, the kid, was asleep on one of the train seats in the third car. He was curled up on one of the bench seats, pulling himself into a tight ball, and when I called his name, he woke up almost fearfully. I told him it was okay. I was a park ranger, and I was here to help him. He seemed overjoyed to see me, smiling as he wrapped me in a hug. I was exploring, and I found the old house that the carpenter man made. I wanted to go inside and look, but it was all locked up. So I went down the trail, and then I went down another trail, and that's when I found the train. I didn't know there was a train in the woods, so I got on, but it doesn't seem to stop. It just runs and runs, and I'm starting to get hungry. I ate some of the snacks from the little stand at the station, but the food car doesn't seem to have any food, and I'm really thirsty. I gave him some of my provisions out of my backpack and told him I'd sit with him until the train decided to stop. He seemed confused when I told him that the train had stopped to pick me up, but he figured it must have been while he was asleep. I asked him how long he had been on the train, but he said he didn't know. Felt like it might have only been hours, but sometimes he said it felt like it had been running longer than that. It doesn't always go through the woods either. I look out the window and sometimes there are mountains, sometimes there are deserts, and one time it even looked like we were underwater. The train just kind of goes, but I don't know where it's taking me. In hindsight, the kid wasn't wrong. Felt like we rode that train for days, the scenery shift being the only way to tell the actual track of time. Eventually, the food in my pack ran out. It hadn't been much to start with, a couple of water bottles and an MRE, along with a few granola bars. As we watched the woods turn into the prairies for the third time, I started to wonder if I'd ever get off this train. At some point, I must have dozed off because I came to and found that the train had stopped. We were back in the woods, the doors were open, and before I could think too hard about it, I picked up the kid and ran for the doors. He had been asleep as well, and he jerked awake as I grabbed him up. He quieted down when he saw it was me, but he seemed confused when we came out onto the pickup area. "Are we back? Did the train finally let us go?" I told him it seemed to have, and as the train closed its doors and rolled off again, we made our way back to the real world. Michael was reunited with his family an hour later. A search party found us as we came out by Carpenter's cabin, but they were no longer just looking for Michael. This search party was looking for me. According to the Park Service, I'd been missing for the last 12 hours. They'd been calling me for most of that time without answer, and dispatch had redirected one of the teams after they hadn't found the kid either. I told them the battery on my walkie must have gone dead, and I think they were mostly just glad that I'd found the kid. Michael tried to tell them about the train, but nobody seemed to believe him. I shrugged when they asked me about it, and the kid looked hurt until I gave him a little wink. I don't think anybody would believe us about a train in the middle of the woods, but I probably should have prepared him for that. I've been back on that trail since, but it's just a trail now. It doesn't go anywhere except the outflow utility road, and it seems the forest train only appears when it wants to be found. There are a lot of strange things in the woods, some of which I'm beginning to see. I'll keep you guys updated if I see anything else, if the Forestry Service doesn't shut me down first, that is. Till then, stay safe when you're out in the woods. Don't go taking rides from weird trains you find out in the woods while hiking unfamiliar paths. You never know where they might let you out at. You're still here. Thanks so much for joining us for tonight's spooky tale. If you'd like a little bit more spooky in your life, why not click on one of the videos that appears at the end of our story? Or maybe head on over to one of our playlists where you can get your fill of spooky content. If you like your spooky a little more tactile, I've got a new book that's come out. If you'd like your own copy, there's a link below in the description where you can get your own copy of my spooky book. If you like what you see here on the channel and think you might like to support in a more monetized way, then why not come over to Patreon or become a member on YouTube? Speaking of, let's go ahead and thank our members now. Thanks to Civ Garstad and Unicorn Hollow for being our spooky ghost contributors. Thanks to Janet, Lee Kendall, Saikat, Ronda J, Sue Casper, and Valinator for being our spooky skeleton tier contributors. And thanks to Hi Stacy, Winter, Xaronan, Stephanie Carrington, Tyler Parker, Cinnamon Fox, Sarah ASMR42, Grim Reaper, and TomBoiTopUwU for being our Ghostly Reader tier contributors. And a special thanks to Grim Reaper, who appears to have subscribed not just on YouTube, but also on my Patreon. Thanks, everyone. We just couldn't do the show without you, and your support is always appreciated. If you'd like to support the channel, then come on down to Patreon, or become a member on YouTube. Spooky Skeleton tier contributors, that's our $5 tier, get their spooky 12 hours early, at 8:30 a.m., as opposed to 8:30 p.m., my time, of course. And while Ghostly Reading is only a tier that's available on Patreon, you get a signed copy of my book anytime I write one on your doorstep in, hopefully, a timely manner. If you'd like a book, we have many on Amazon. I've got links below if you'd like to follow those. Should get you to my page so you can buy any one of my 8 books I believe we're up to now. I'm sure they'd look really nice on your shelf, and I'll sign them for you if you can find me out in the wild. And as always, thanks for stopping by. Dr. Plague, signing off. Have a wonderful evening.